welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the channel where normally your host Dave, aka me, is in the 25-year process of collecting and reviewing every English language Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X game released. The reason why I say normally is because occasionally I do other things as well, such as the last video for the channel, which was a look at the Framemeister and RetroTink 5X upscalers. That video has done extremely well, and I would like to thank each and every one of you that took a moment to give that a look. I hope you enjoyed it. Except one person I know didn't because they disliked it on YouTube, and to that, all I can say is that they must have been an Elgato fanboy, because I admittedly did go a little hard at them for issues with the 4K60 Pro card. Seriously, pick up an Evermedia Live Gamer 4K instead if you want to do video capture from gaming consoles. It's just better gear. Anyway, if an in-depth analysis of 30-year-old 8 and 16-bit Sega games and the occasional other video sounds interesting to you, I heartily recommend you subscribe, as this 25-year schedule has me uploading a new video every week, although not always on the same day, because you never know when you might have to drive down to Georgia and help your friend move to a house that the bank forgot to get underwritten until the day before the closing. Yes, that really did happen, so believe me when I say I wasn't slacking off last week. I'm just not good enough yet to have some extra videos in the can to cover weeks off. Maybe someday, though, especially since it looks like we've got the return of convention soon. This week's video is about a game that you might see at one of those conventions, but not because it's old, rare, and kept behind plexiglass requiring you to take out a second mortgage to pay for it, like I might have just done for a totally unrelated Master System title from Brazil. No, this week's video is a game that's new. Reviewing quote-unquote new games on Zilog and Moto, while not the main focus of the channel, is something I like to do occasionally, as it gives a nice bit of variety to the content, and some of these games are good. Like, really good, and you'd be doing yourself a serious disservice to act like new releases for the Genesis ended in 1998. Xenocrisis, episode 48. Now, as crazy as I am with this collection, I'm not crazy enough to try and collect absolutely everything that's been released for the Genesis after the fact, so to speak, as there's some titles that never came out in the United States originally for a good reason. Duke Nukem 3D, I'm looking squarely at you. And then there's some other titles that, while they're fine as homebrews and maybe fun for messing around with in an emulator or on an EverDrive, they had no business getting a physical release. This week's game, The Curse of Illmoore Bay, is in that former category, being a fully developed title and not just something that someone threw together while experimenting with coding for the Motorola 68000. I actually wasn't aware of the title originally, but through working on this channel, a rep from Second Dimension reached out to me and mentioned how there had been this new title coming out and that I might be interested in taking a look. After a cursory look at some of the screenshots, this definitely seemed like it wouldn't be the worst title I looked at Zilog and Moto, so I purchased a copy, and here we are. What is The Curse of Illmoore Bay? Well, we'll get into all that in a bit, but to sum up, it's a platformer that takes you through 6 areas in the town of Illmoore Bay, with 3 levels in each to explore using one of 3 characters. Like I said, not just a cheap homebrew. But just how good is it? That's coming up, right after our traditional look at the package. And this is my copy of The Curse of Illmoore Bay, as you can see. As you may be familiar, either just from watching this channel over the last few years, or from being a Sega fan in general, Sega had 2 main release styles for the games in the United States during the original lifespan of the Genesis. Starting out with the plastic clamshells that go back to the days of the Master System, but then in late 1994, Sega started to shift to cardboard boxes for their releases in an apparent cost-cutting effort, and this packaging was also used for the Sega's 32X releases as well. Unless you lived in the UK, and then the switch to cardboard packaging never happened, with the exception of Sonic & Knuckles, which needed it due to its odd cartridge shape. The reason why I mention all this is it seems that the post-Y2K Genesis releases have gone both ways with the packaging, with publishers like Pico Interactive, MegaCat Games, and Watermelon opting to use clamshell packaging, and then Super Fighter Team utilizing the cardboard box format, and even incorporating the later red bar formatting to the packaging. Honestly, I vastly prefer the clamshells, and I think if you ask Genesis fans, they probably would mostly agree with that sentiment, but at least these days we have these nice acrylic boxes to protect these, and then that's what I'm doing here. Although, I do have to point out one thing, and I know this is going to come across as nitpicking, but if you take a look at the slipcover, notice how it's bowed out a bit? Apparently, at least my copy was manufactured just a bit off and it's too big. It's not a big deal at all, and maybe I just got a bad one, but as a result, you do have to be a bit more careful when using these box protectors. Just something to keep an eye out for if you pick up a copy. Moving on from the nitpicking, even though Second Dimension went with a cardboard box, they did not opt for the red bar format, which I think was a great choice as it really opens up the art and allows it to wrap fully around the front to the spine and then to the back. And the art itself is great and really stands out with the drawings of Cole, Scarlet, and Issa looking particularly nice. However, what's up with that logo? Why is Curse dropped down like that with the bottom of the R overlapping Illmoore below it? And I get that they're trying to make the Illmoore Bay stand out and appear old for story reasons, but it's kind of hard to read. A more basic, properly formatted logo might have been a better choice here. Flipping over the back, and things are definitely simpler here, but still, why is the second line overlapping the bottom of the R? There's plenty of space available, so this just seems a bit sloppy. The flavor text below takes a less is more philosophy and gives a super basic game explanation. And again, I understand doing things for artistic purposes, but I really would have used a basic font here, and I don't know, maybe at least given the names for the characters on the front of the box? The screenshots over the right are decent quality, albeit pretty small, and again, I'm not sure why given the available space. One last thing, you may have noticed that the game states that it's for 1 or 2 players, and that's true. However, it's in the style of Super Mario World, where you alternate play between player 1 and player 2 throughout the levels, so there's no simultaneous action. Opening up the package gives us the manual and the cartridge is pretty heavy. Not sure what they did different in producing these, but it certainly doesn't feel cheap. The manual has a thick cardstock cover for some nice durability, and is in color throughout, which is a nice bonus for Genesis fans who are used to black and white manuals. The manual does a good job of explaining the game, and I think my only gripe would be where it describes the 3 characters, as it mentions as an aside that they have different strengths and weaknesses, but it doesn't say what they are. Other than that, I like all the nice touches, like having the world map on the inside of the front cover, art for all the enemies and bosses, and not a high score table at the end, but a checklist for all the collectibles and the levels to help keep track of what you've been able to obtain so far. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game itself and see if this is something you should be seeking out for your own collection. As I mentioned earlier, the Curse of Illmoore Bay is a side-scrolling platformer, so if you're immediately flooded of thoughts of other 16-bit platformers like Era the Acrobat or Bubsy or other similar titles, then you're in the proper mindset. However, I definitely wouldn't directly compare this game to those two, just like saying Bubsy is a Sonic the Hedgehog clone isn't a correct statement. I mean, it kind of is, but I'm getting off topic, and that's a whole different argument that I'll take up when I get around to reviewing Bubsy. The whole point I'm trying to make is that while the Curse of Illmoore Bay shares certain elements with other platforming titles, it's definitely its own unique game. Let's start with the setup for the game. The plot is probably one of the weaker elements of the game. Granted, the plot with these titles usually isn't super important, as many younger players aren't really paying attention to why the things on the screen are happening, but even by light standards, it's a bit odd. The short version is, apparently there's a town called Illmoore Bay, and there's some document from the year 1346 that talks about some sort of battle between humans and nightmare creatures, and that it's somehow related to these 3 statues that are in town. Now, immediately I have questions, because the Americas weren't really colonized until the 16th century, so was this document the creation of indigenous peoples? Or is Illmoore Bay in Europe somewhere? It's unclear and just seems like a really odd starting point. Beyond this, let's get back to those statues. Now, you should remember the cover art which shows the heroes of the game, Cole, Scarlet, and Issa. Seems like your average kids, nothing crazy, and definitely something that would appeal to the younger crowd. But if you watch the intro to the game and pay attention to the plot I mentioned, these protectors, which have been locked into these statues since 1346, gargoyle style, look like average, everyday preteen American kids. And again, I know I'm complaining about idiosyncrasies with a game where the super short version of the plot is a mall employee hated Christmas so much that he read a spell that turned the town into live-action Halloween. But still, this is the best I could come up with? Really? Anyway, let's move on and actually get into the game properly. As mentioned previously, the game consists of 18 levels split into 6 sections around the town of Illmoore Bay, and each section having 3 levels. It's very similar to how the original Sonic the Hedgehog is set up, with the first 2 levels in a section being normal levels, and then the 3rd level having a boss at the end that you have to defeat before you can move on to the next area of town. It's a pretty basic setup, but it works, and the only complaint I would make is just that it's been done before. However, thankfully the designers at Second Dimension weren't done. Curse of Illmoore Bay isn't just a linear experience of going from one level to the next. I mean, I suppose you could play it that way, but I certainly don't think that's the best way to experience it. Instead, when a level is beaten for the first time, you are presented with an overhead map of the town, and your chosen character will move to the next level in the game, represented by a dot on the map in that section of town. If you've played Super Mario Bros. 3 or Super Mario World, this is definitely representative of that style. And if you haven't played either of those games, what on earth are you doing watching this review? Seriously, drop what you're doing and go boot up Super Mario World. It's one of the best games ever made, and that's coming from a Sega fan. Where were we? Oh yes, the overworld map. When you defeat a level while the path to the next level is opened up, you don't necessarily have to play that next level right away. You could play the same level you just beat over again, or you could walk back to a previous level for a second round. Why would you want to do this? Well, for a few reasons. The first and probably most important reason is to collect power-ups that were previously missed. To beat a level in the game, you must progress with your character from left to right across the stage, collect a key that appears at some point in that stage, and then open up the corresponding door in said stage to move on, which is usually at the rightmost portion, but not always. However, as you progress through the levels, you will see other doors and keys that you may not be able to get on your first visit to those levels. The reason for this is the game's power-up system. When you start the game, all 3 characters have the same initial power-up, a blast that can attack enemies from across the screen, allowing you to cause damage without getting up close and personal and risking getting hit. However, as you progress through the game, each time you defeat an area boss, you gain a new power-up. For instance, when you defeat the first boss, you gain the Batwing ability, which allows you to hover in the air and float left and right. And then when you defeat the second boss, you gain a dash ability, which allows you to cross pits without falling. With these newly gained abilities, areas and levels that were previously inaccessible now become available, allowing you to collect keys and access bonus doors to gain more power-ups, giving the levels a legit reason to be replayed. There's also another reason for replaying levels, although it's decidedly more optional. When playing a level, at the end you can have one of 5 ratings. These ratings are determined based on if you finish the level with full health, kill all the enemies in the level, and if you collect all of the candies interspersed in each of the levels. To my knowledge, this doesn't really give you anything other than a nice star when you look at the level after completion, but achievement chasers will definitely enjoy this additional challenge. Speaking of achievements, this game has those too. Sort of. One of the things that was so revolutionary about the Xbox 360 was the creation of achievements, or trophies if you're a PlayStation fan. Before that, while some games had multiple endings or other bonuses for doing certain things in the game, they were usually one-off things and didn't provide the feeling of getting an award for doing something special. Now, I know that achievements don't really have anything to do with gameplay and they're just sort of a bonus, but to me, it's really cool to see a 16-bit title that includes them, as I'm not aware of another game from this generation of consoles that has a similar feature. And this is yet another way that Second Dimension has attempted to add replayability to the game. However, replaying the game, or even just playing it to begin with, is only fun if the game is any good to begin with. And this is where the game is probably going to be somewhat controversial for players. The Curse of Illmoore Bay features a pretty simple control scheme, with the default A button being mapped to your special ability, whatever is currently chosen, the B button being your jump button, and the C button your attack. And then you can adjust your special ability in the pause menu. There's no 6-button configuration option because it's not needed, but you can reconfigure the buttons if you want. I really have no issues with the control scheme, and it seems appropriately simple for a side-scrolling platformer. Where problems crop up is in 3 areas: the differing abilities between the 3 main characters, the response delay on attacks by the characters, and the fact that sometimes hitting button combinations doesn't work quite the way you might expect. I mentioned earlier that one of the gaps in the manual is that while it's mentioned that Cole, Scarlet, and Issa have different strengths and weaknesses, it's never stated exactly what they are. In trial and error in playing with each of the 3, it seems like the power of the character's standing attacks, jumping attacks, and then the speed of said attacks is what differs. I ended up settling on Scarlet as it seems like she has the best jump kick, and didn't mind that her standing attack is a little weaker. And your mileage may vary here depending on your playstyle. More of an issue than not having the strengths and weaknesses spelled out is the issue of attack animation delay. No matter which character you pick, although some more than others, they will have a few frames of animation to their attack. Normally in platformers this isn't a big deal, as it's so quick it doesn't affect the gameplay. But in the Curse of Illmoore Bay, you'll need to lead your attacks at least a second before you would think to normally, or else your characters will get hurt, and then you'll need to get out of the way quickly or run the risk of taking more damage. This is probably my least favorite aspect of the game, but at least it's something that you can adjust to with practice. My final control issue is that attacks that involve jumping and attacking just don't seem to be smoothly implemented. Jump kicking into a direction seems fine, but if you try to just jump straight in the air and then attack, usually you're going to get hit instead. Along with this seemingly broken mechanic is the fact that when you jump and attempt to use your shot ability, it won't shoot from the top of your jump, unless you hold down the jump button while attacking. Otherwise you'll just fire off a shot from the ground, which defeats the purpose of attempting a jumping attack to begin with. I'm not sure if this is an engine problem or what, but it definitely could have used some more polish. From an audio-visual perspective, The Curse of Illmoore Bay is a decent effort, especially considering it's from a small independent studio. It's certainly not the best graphics on the Genesis, but I do like the use of color in game, the amount of animation frames used for each of the characters, the occasional smattering of some nice parallax effects, and just the cartoonish style in general. While the levels don't do anything besides scroll left and right, and the backgrounds get somewhat repetitive, I do like how each area has its own style and their own set of enemies, rather than just fighting the same ones the entire game. The music in game is great as well, and one benefit of these later released Genesis games is that with the sound synthesis hardware being over 30 years old now, creating good quality soundtracks for these games has really become more about the composer than any actual technical hurdles. I think my only complaint about the audio is that while the music is always on point, the sound effects sometimes seem to be at such a low level that most of them you can barely hear. I assume this was just an oversight, and it doesn't truly ruin the game, but it is noticeable in places. All in all, and actually I ended up going a lot longer than I planned here, I'm going to give The Curse of Illmoore Bay 3 stars. Admittedly, like previous platformers that I've reviewed in Decap Attack and Wonder Boy, I didn't have time to finish the entire game before producing this review, which is why there's only footage from the first 3 levels. But I'm sure that with enough time I would have been able to, and also like those 2 games, I have a definite desire to go back and finish the game. The game is definitely not perfect, hence only 3 stars, but I love the modern features, the Super Mario World inspired world map, and the levels that give you a reason to come back for more. Genesis platformer fans should definitely give this one a look. Okay, that was the Curse of Illmoore Bay. This was yet another one of those games that you really have to play for a bit and not just give up on, because after a few hours when you've settled on a character and gotten adjusted to the controls, the game definitely opens up a bit and becomes much less frustrating. You're still going to be jumping into the occasional pit and having to go through the levels multiple times before you're successful, but there is a solid title here just below the surface. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's sports sequel time again, and it actually ties in nicely to the Stanley Cup playoffs that are going on right now. I know there's an obvious change between this game and the game I looked at previously in episode 17, but I'm curious as to what changed besides that. And I'm just happy to play a game from this series again, so I'll definitely enjoy next week's trip down memory lane, and it'll be a good way to forget how terrible the Blackhawks and Rangers were this year. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.